Hello, and thank you for joining Skystone Partners today for our first fall installment of On Giving, Incisive Commentary and Analysis at the Intersection of Philanthropy and Greater Good. I'm Liz Knuppel, and I'm the President and CEO of Skystone Partners, where we believe philanthropy is a powerful force for good. I'm proud to welcome you, attendees, and our guest, David Patrick King, who is the Karen Lee Buttrey Director of the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving and an Associate Professor of Philanthropic Studies at Indiana University's Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. Hello, David.
Hey, Liz. So good to be here.
I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're here. So our guests here today, David is an expert on philanthropy. He is a teacher and a researcher, but most specifically, David's expertise is the influence of faith on giving, which is what we're going to be talking about a little bit today. So let me introduce you to our esteemed guest and share a little bit about some of his accomplishments and why we've invited him to be with us. As I mentioned, David is the Karen Lee Buttrey Director of Lake Institute on Faith and Giving, as well as an associate professor at the School of Philanthropy. He arrived in 2014 after having served at the Memphis Theological Seminary in Memphis. As an American religious historian, his research interests broadly include exploring the practices of 20th century and 21st century American and global faith communities, as well as more specifically investigating how the religious identity of faith-based nonprofits shape their motivations, rhetoric, and practice. He's the author of the recent winner of the Peter Dopkins Hall Prize for Best Book in the History of Philanthropy. It's God's Internationalists, World Vision, and the Age of Evangelical Humanitarianism, which is actually how David and I became acquainted originally. And World Vision, and we'll talk a little bit about them and their fundraising. They're the largest Christian humanitarian organization, and the book sort of investigates the evolving understandings of religious identity, international development, and public policy within the history of international relief and development organizations. In addition to David's focus on religion, humanitarianism, and philanthropy, he focuses broadly on a wide variety of organizational models and contexts, and particularly is focused on congregation. He continues to foster conversations around the dynamic relationship between faith and giving across all traditions, religiosity, and individual giving, particularly on the trends around religion and spirituality. He's passionate about research and teaching, but as an ordained minister, having served several local churches and national faith-based organizations, he's also fueled by facilitating conversations with faith leaders, donors, and fundraisers around the intersections of faith and giving. He routinely teaches and leads conversations around the country through the Lake Institute's training courses, and has been interviewed in such national outlets as the Washington Post, The Atlantic, NPR, Religion News Service, and the Chronicle of Philanthropy. Welcome, David, and I hope you all are as eager to hear what David has to say as I am.
Yeah, again, it's so good to be here. Thanks so much for the chance to share a bit on this intersection of faith and giving.
Excellent, excellent. Before we get to our interview, I want to give our attendees just a little bit of housekeeping news. So before we begin our conversation, there are a couple of things. First of all, about format, we'll have some opportunity for discussion with David about his expertise, and then we'll have a few minutes for select questions from you all before we wrap up the conversation. If you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A component in Zoom. It's down there at the bottom, sort of should be central left section of your screen. And if you use that, our question moderator, Bill Mulvihill, who's currently behind the scenes, he'll receive your questions. And Bill is here to curate the questions so that we make sure that we're getting everything consolidated and we can answer things as efficiently and effectively as possible. So, down to business. David. Faith-based giving, and I think probably most everybody here in the room is familiar with the Giving USA report, which was just published. Faith-based giving is the largest sector and has been over time, but it's declining. And, is that related to changing patterns in attendance and giving in religious organizations? Tell us a little bit, sort of history about religious giving and maybe how those trends are changing these days.
Yeah, it's a great question, and as far as we know, as long as we've been tracking through our research at Giving USA that the School of Philanthropy helps produce alongside the Giving Institute, we've seen that religion has been the largest subsector of the charitable giving pie. So this past year, it made up about 27% of all giving, which is by far the biggest sector. Really, it's almost double the next largest sector, being like social services or education. But if we look back to even the 1980s, when we first started tracking some of these sectors, religion made up over half, almost 58% of all giving in America.
Yeah.
So the glass half full, for those who are really interested in religious giving, is that it continues to make up by far the largest subsector. But over these past 40 years or so, we have seen it decline as a share of the larger charitable giving pie. Now, there are a number of reasons why that might be true, and we don't know exactly why, but we've also seen some shifts in declines in religious affiliation, for instance. Fewer people are affiliating with a particular religious tradition. They might still have some sort of spiritual identity, but they're not maybe affiliating as a Catholic, a Presbyterian, a Lutheran. In addition, things like religious attendance. People are attending their local congregation or their faith community less often, and are sort of maybe less likely to be a member of a particular local congregation, parish, mosque, synagogue. So in a recent Gallup poll, we saw that the percentage of Americans that are members of a particular faith community has just gone down below 50% for the first time in the history of America in really ways. So these shifts, while we don't know exactly how they're connected, some of those shifts, I think we could be pretty confident are sort of connected to how this giving is shifting in the religious giving landscape.
Sure. And so when you say attendance is down, does that include, I think it does, but I just want to clarify, because trends I had heard, and it's old news, by the way, is that non-denominational Christian congregations had grown, but it was the specific denominations that were losing attendance. Are we seeing really that losing attendance and religious affiliation overall is really and truly going down across the spectrum?
In a nutshell, yes. So to your point, so the earlier story we used to tell was that sort of like maybe the back door of mainline Protestants or Catholic traditions became the front door of the evangelical non-denominational megachurches. So you'd see religious switching, moving from one tradition to another, most often within a particular faith tradition. So, for instance, the mainline Protestant tradition, some of what we might think of sort of some of the larger denominations like the United Methodists, Presbyterians, Lutherans, Disciples of Christ, would see their percentage shrinking as sort of the more born-again, evangelical, non-denominational congregations were growing. But recent trends are showing that we're losing, the Southern Baptists are losing, percentages of numbers similarly to other traditions too. So what we're seeing is just a disaffiliation from a particular religious tradition. Even if people talk about having some sense of religious or spiritual values, they're not tied to a tradition or to a set of institutions like congregations in the same way they once were.
Right. And that's kind of interesting. Folks are joining less, right? And it's kind of interesting. And actually yesterday, I'm going to pull this book out. I'm not going to wave it around too much. But yesterday we had a little bit of a conversation about American history and how we have this history of joining associations. And I had shared with you, I'd been to the Library of Congress in the spring, and there's this wonderful temporary exhibit on voluntary associations in the United States. And I showed the book, and we talked a little bit about that. And I'm curious because you said, well, gosh, that That's an interesting concept. And, religious affiliation and voluntary associations may actually have a connection relative to giving. And I wonder if you might want to share your thoughts a little bit with our group on sort of our history as joiners and giving, not just with religious associations, but, civic associations as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's clear that we have all types of shapes and sizes of, civil societies, civic associations, like you mentioned, but from sort of our earliest history, particularly in the late 18th through the 19th century, most of the voluntary associations that really drew American individuals together in local communities were most often faith-based. So you can think of whether it was movements towards social action and justice-oriented issues like abolition or women's suffrage, or many of the other early education. So the Sunday school movement was actually not so much to bring people into religious education as it was meant to help sort of become like early primary literacy reading for kids around the country. Think about the temperance campaigns, not so much just about the prohibition of alcohol, but trying to kind of create a sort of a healthy civil society. So Alexis de Tocqueville, kind of the famous Frenchman who journeys over to America, sort of the distinctives that he brought up, he saw both a vibrant religious life and voluntary associations as somewhat of an American distinctive. And so those traditions have kind of been interwoven together throughout our history. And the religious identity of many of those associations or organizations may have evolved over time, but oftentimes it has been faith communities or faith-based organizations that have been somewhat the bedrock in many of our, whether it's rural, urban, suburban communities, to kind of bring us together.
Right, exactly. And so I think what you're saying is, giving back with our time and our talent, the way that we do it as Americans is uniquely American, and something different than what our old world friend Alexis de Tocqueville had seen before. But there was a lot of this that was maybe founded in the association founded in the church, or at least with those religious affiliations. So you're saying that really there's a place for all, and it could be that with giving, I'm extrapolating here, but giving moving away from religious organizations, those common tenets that formed these associations to do better, to do good, to teach children literacy, or to abolish slavery, those tenets, maybe finding what had been, religious giving and funded through the church, potentially, I'm making this up now, are now being funded otherwise. That's kind of a statement extrapolation question.
Yeah. Oh, and one thing that makes America unique in the philanthropic landscape around associational life in particular is that there was this both and of a strong formation of institutions through these voluntary associations that were often informal or became extremely formalized and networked across the country. So whether it was through media, whether it was through travel, these associations brought us together, even though they were localized. So they were established in some way, but America, one of its unique qualities, particularly around religion, was the freedom of religion. So many came from other parts of the world because of this freedom of religion, but it allowed for, strong religious traditions to kind of dominate, even as it allowed for many forms of religious diversity and sort of a vibrant religious marketplace that would sort of compete. Traditions would compete with one another for market
recruitment.
Yeah,
market share.
That created some sense of a vibrant for-profit, but also non-profit type of set of associations where they were tied to the particular needs and communities. And as that's developed, just like the philanthropic landscape generally, many would hope that as philanthropists or other forms of nonprofits do that work, then others would pick it up. It would be implemented into government policy or government, social services. And that's happened, as well as a variety of different nonprofit that sort of have become that foundational force, particularly in the early 20th century, where you see the professionalized nature of philanthropy, through the Gilded Age with the Rockefellers and the Carnegie, sort of robber barons, but also the development of social work and other types of professionalized social services that take some of that earlier, maybe even charitable framing of associational life and professionalize it into more of a scientific philanthropy or more of a sort of professionalized set of social services.
Right, right. So we've talked a fair amount about philanthropy and its connection to organized religion and religiosity here in the United States. But one of the things that I'm keenly interested in is I know that your book on world vision is tremendously interesting and important, and I had a chance to read it. And World Vision is one of the largest Christian organizations in the world, one of the biggest charities. And tell me a little bit about why you wanted to look into them as it relates to philanthropy and giving, not just here, but around the world.
Yeah, so in many ways, looking at World Vision as one of the largest sort of nonprofits working in the faith-based sector, but sort of as a leader in international relief and development around the world in over 100 countries, at the table in Geneva or Davos or DC, thinking about the policies, whether it's the USAID or UN development goals, et cetera. What I wanted to do, particularly as a historian who likes to work up to the present, is looking how the identity and practices, whether those be fundraising practices or how they implement the work on the ground, have evolved over time. And so one thing that I would want to emphasize when we're talking about faith and giving is the religious identity of a nonprofit or of a donor is extremely complex, complicated, and we can't simply say, just because we know someone's a Muslim or a Christian or their organizations are founded by those type of individuals, that we know everything about that organization. Mm-hmm. So World Vision, which was founded in 1950 in the midst of the Korean War, really to help Korean War orphans and sort of disaster immediate needs in Korea at that time, evolved over time through Vietnam, through a lot of the particularly famine, famine in Ethiopia in the 1980s, for example, and its own identity evolved both in the US and then around the world. And part of that, particularly for me, was interesting was its fundraising practices and adopting mass media. So they were some of the first to dig into kind of 24-hour telethons and images of children and others around the world that sometimes we might look back on now and think that were inappropriate as far as sort of taking advantage of individuals on the ground. So for me, looking at World Vision is just one test case of how we need to attend to the identity of an organization, see how it changes over time. So I would challenge any of our organizations in the work that we do at Lake Institute. We often are thinking about attending to, what is your founding history? What are the mission, vision, values? What does that mean about the staff that you hire, the types of ways that you raise money? Who do you partner with? Secular organizations, just other faith-based organizations. What does the work look like that you're doing? Those questions are really important for each and every nonprofit to think through. And I think oftentimes how we engage as donors with these varieties of nonprofits is maybe tied to some of those questions around religious identity, but also practice in the work that we do.
Right, right. And I wonder when you're doing your work in the Lake Institute and you challenge faith-based organizations to say, who are you working with? Who are you hiring? How are you raising money? It seems to me, when you think about how people give, they give typically first to their faith community, second to their alma mater, and then third, I forget it, I'm a bad student, but it's always the first, right? Or very often the first. How a faith-based organization look at itself and actually implement the work it's doing through who it hires, who it partners with, how it raises money and the like? How might that be more critical in a faith-based organization than in a secular organization?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one thing that we might just note before we move into that in particular is when we were talking about religious giving earlier,
Yeah.
sort of that subsector within the like the Giving USA picture, for example, that religious giving number that we talked about, moving from 58% down to 27% today, really is narrowly defined as the primary purpose of an organization. So
Mm-hmm.
the religious giving grouping subsector really is congregations, denominations, missionary societies, and religious media like Christian radio, for
Right.
example. So
Right.
what it's not including is an organization like World Vision or the
Okay.
Salvation Army,
Mm-hmm.
Catholic Charities, World Jewish Relief, all the religious education, or what colleges, universities, or private religious schools. None of that counts within that religious giving number. So if we look at it and ask donors
Mm-hmm.
themselves if the organizations to which they give are faith-based, and Lake is going to have a bit more specific sort of new research on this by the end of the year, so stay tuned. It could be up as much as 73% of all giving going to a faith-based organization. Now, those
Okay.
numbers are a handful of years old. Looking at the data that we're working with right now, it might be slightly lower than that, but it's well over half of all giving goes to faith-based organizations as defined by the donor.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important to see, maybe even as that narrowing or that shrinking religious giving pie, that we don't sort of misinterpret the narrative to think that people are not engaged or giving to faith-based organizations. It may be, Liz, as you mentioned, sort of that faith community, that congregation, for instance, may not be as purely that first place to give as it once was.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes, congregations sort of became kind of the clearinghouse for funds from their community, and then disperse those to local communities or to national or international bodies to do that kind of work. But oftentimes, nonprofits have maybe done a better job of telling their story and engaging in fundraising practices directly to individuals. And so maybe someone of a faith background may or may not give to their congregation. They may also give to 3 or 4 different organizations.
Right.
People who are not religious at all would give to these organizations too. So plenty of people who may not have a faith tradition would want to give to the Salvation Army or to
Right.
Catholic Charities to do that immediate facing work. So again, kind of that complicated story, but I think one thing we're seeing is that dispersion of the variety of nonprofits is building on the commitments and values of donors, as well as a wide variety of donors as well. And so an organization needs to think about maybe multiple messages to different types of donors coming from their faith identity. Maybe they, again, sort of being clear about who they are, but they might be able to demonstrate what they're doing well within within individuals within their same tradition. Maybe they do that differently than if they're speaking to kind of a more mass audience in a mailing or in a social media campaign.
Right. So what I hear you saying is when we look at the decline in religious giving, we may not really be, I'm going to quote Michael Stipe here, we're maybe not really losing our religion. Right. There are, and perhaps the churches were the clearinghouses dispersing the money out, and perhaps organizations were developed and have broken off, or as you say, have been telling their stories more effectively. And so how would a faith-based organization think about, these multiple identities?
Yeah, I think that is the money question. I think it's an important one. So again, the narrative is important. And oftentimes one thing that we're talking about in the work that we do with organizations is the landscape itself is definitely shifting. So religious identity, spiritual identity, the way that religious institutions are working within this broader landscape is definitely changing. There is the ground is shifting beneath our feet. But I think I would hesitate to say that the sky is falling, to kind of take that Chicken Little approach.
Yeah.
So we don't need to simply sort of curl up and kind of say, well, this is a continual decline. But the landscape is shifting. So I would encourage organizations to do the hard work to think about how they, what is their sort of their root founding, their mission and values, how has that evolved over time, and be able to narrate that to their staff, to their board, but also to think about what that means for who they partner with, who they take funds from. Some faith organizations don't want to engage in government support, government grants. An organization like World Vision takes millions, close to maybe $1 billion from the United Nations, from the Gates Foundation, from USAID. So being clear on who you are is important. And thinking about the broad, just the broad universe, diverse universe of nonprofits within your particular sector. Maybe you're working with in higher education or clean water, or in a particular region of the world. One story that I particularly learned from World Vision's story is how the global context really changed who they were. And so faith looks a lot differently maybe in Southeast Asia or in Africa or in Australia than it does in the United States. And so learning from Indigenous staff, local communities, and how that impacts who we are is super important for an international NGO, but definitely for, I would say, any group that's working with local communities, no matter where they are.
Sure. And so I'm going to ask you to take that, pardon me, one step further. I'm going to put you on the spot here. And I'd like to ask if there is a specific instance that you can, an example, maybe as you were studying World Vision, that our listeners here today on our webcast might be able to take away with them, how World Vision said, how does faith look different here? How can we adapt to it? And how can we make our service delivery and our fundraising here more effective? And I know I'm putting you a little bit on the spot here for an example, but I wonder if there's something that we might be able to, theoretically, this is gold, 100%. But what did they do? Maybe in Southeast Asia, or as you say, in Australia, or South Africa or somewhere.
Yeah, well, I would say maybe just a couple of things. One thing I think they did was they were confronted by the local staff that they employed around the world. So they moved away from, and this was because, not just because it was good, they sort of, from my perspective, led ahead of where international development was as a sort of theoretical frame at that point, and wanting to hire an indigenous local workforce and not having expats coming over from Canada, the United States, to do that work. That was a theological value for them. That was not simply that they thought that was the best way to do work, but theologically, because of their faith tradition, they saw the need to engage locally. And that had sort of a ripple effect back through the organization to where they actually spent a lot of time, a lot of resources, and it was not an easy task for them to create a global organization of over 100 country offices where they shared leadership. So the US and basically Canada, Australia, the sort of key Western partners that were the funding pieces of the organization, decided to share leadership throughout the larger global body. And so as a federated nonprofit, like many other organizations of that scale, they sort of relinquished a lot of control over what the organization might look like because they felt the need to share that with the global community. I think one other thing over time was that they were confronted by maybe their theological background led them to think more about maybe evangelism or sharing the gospel, and not as much on how to do that alongside basic humanitarian need, feeding people, clothing people. And that led to really strong reflections about issues of social justice. Take the apartheid in South Africa at that particular moment in time, where they would step out on those kinds of issues and felt that they could lead. So a lot of our nonprofits are trying to balance that line between doing the work and speaking out and being an advocate and lobbying and sort of things about policy and practice. Those are questions that many of us face, and thinking about how our values inform our decisions there, I think, would be important to think about.
Right. And I think what you're saying is that isn't unique to faith-based organizations. that we have a lot more commonalities. If folks have only worked with secular organizations, that there may be a whole lot more commonalities between that sort of faith tradition and mission of the organization of a religious organization, or an organization that comes out of a faith tradition, and that one does not, that there really is maybe a whole lot more commonality, and making sure we're representative of the folks we seek to serve, help, engage, enlighten across the whole organization.
I think that's right. As a leader in a nonprofit, but I would say particularly as a fundraiser,
Mm-hmm.
I could be agnostic about anyone's particular faith tradition or background. But just kind of to speak crassly, I think you're leaving money on the table, or you're not engaging with donors in their full capacity. If you're not sort of able and willing to engage them in those deep questions of discerning their passion and their values.
Mm-hmm.
And for many people, for a majority of Americans, that oftentimes comes from their religious, spiritual type of orientation. And so being able to kind of, again, partly with some sort of religious literacy, to know a bit about different faith, the diverse set of religious traditions is helpful.
Mm-hmm.
But beyond that, it's really being able to ask kind of some discerning, deeper questions that good fundraisers are keenly able to do, that sort of taps into that sense of values and ask those discerning questions, so that whether it's their particular, Catholic or Jewish identity that inspires them to give, or whatever that sort of value set might be, I think that's a key skill that's essential to fundraising and doing that work in partnership with donors.
Yeah, absolutely. So these trends in diversity of faith-based philanthropy really does influence giving across the entire sector. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And I think one thing we could say is we know data will show that people of faith give more, they give more often, they volunteer more, and they also give more to religious causes, which you might expect, but also to secular causes. And so people of faith give broadly. And one of the bright, I would say, sort of bright lights of this sort of the dynamic religious landscape in our country and around the world is that our U.S. landscape is becoming increasingly religiously diverse. And so thinking about the variety of traditions, faith traditions, or just what oftentimes can be a sort of a conglomeration of religious and spiritual identities that people are testing out and engaging with. And so to kind of oftentimes, my working theory, my hope is that the polarization that we oftentimes live through politically and culturally and sometimes religiously, putting these intersections of faith and giving together oftentimes can be a place where we can come together across religious difference, oftentimes thinking about the work that we're doing in the world. Out of all of our traditions, the major faith traditions, all are pointing to the need of generosity and giving as a key tenet of their faith tradition. Those are things we can come together around, and again, are sort of North Stars, I think, for us as we try to build or rebuild civil society together in something that we could be excited to take part in.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, David. I'd like to open things up to our guests, our audience members now, and Bill Mulvihill will join us for our Q&A session and he's been behind the scenes sort of keeping tabs. I would encourage you all, as you are listening to David's comments, Bill, if you'd like to join us, put your questions in the Q&A. And Bill, what have we heard? What are some of the things that are on people's minds right now?
We haven't had any feedback yet on questions, but I have one that maybe will stir some discussion. It seems like you talked about mission and values and how important they are. Just from my perspective, the last 20 or 30 years, there seems like that sometimes there's a lot of straying away from mission and values for more personal gain than the greater good. Is that happening?
Yeah, repeat that one more. Try that one more time, Bill.
So it seems like that you have mission values, and then my view, and you said it, working for the greater good. So I think it appears to me, in my experience, that there's been some slippage in mission value greater good that has politicized much of what we used to do. And I think that challenges faith-based organizations when they're being tugged in two different directions.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. So it really is this. I think it's an important sort of set of questions to ask within your organization of how can we be what we are called to be? What is our distinct mission, values, our hedgehog concept, and what are we best at? What are we striving to be about? And how does that intersect with maybe the common good, the public good? But not just assume that we're just going to sort of slide our identity to meet the public good of the moment, right? And so it's difficult to be true to who we are within our identity, but also in what we can be best at. You know, there are a lot of nonprofits out there and NGOs in the world. We need to stay true, even as that can evolve, and so we can change what we do. But being true to that, and then finding ways to engage with, I would hope, a broader network of organizations to make that change happen, but not simply to shift. Big NGOs in particular are usually sometimes shifting their identity based on the grant cycles or funding cycles of USAID or other UN sort of delegations on those kinds of questions.
So I'm a big believer that none of us have enough resource to do what we want to do, and who we partner with is very important. And I think there's been an explosion of nonprofits in the last 20 years, all the way down to I'm sitting at my desk and I'm a nonprofit pushing some idea. How do we get people to understand that coming together in areas where we have commonality has tremendous value and really can motivate others to join our cause?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I saw a study the other day that sort of talked about among Gen Z that 20% of Gen Z were anticipated starting a nonprofit in their lifetime, not working for a nonprofit, starting a nonprofit. So there is this kind of entrepreneurial, let's start something from scratch. It can be sort of small, grassroots. There is this, I think this tendency to just to have a passion and go and try to solve it, start your own thing. So I would love to be able to harness that entrepreneurial passion and vision, but bring it alongside the wisdom and practice that oftentimes comes from organizations that have been in the trenches doing this work for decades. And I think a lot of the organizations that you could kind of help bridge, we need people to help bridge those conversations, right, to bring that together.
There's a question we have. We are a Catholic organization for children with disabilities begun by sisters. We're beginning to wonder if families may not select us because of our religious affiliation, even if we serve all, full stop. Please talk about how to portray ourselves while staying true to our roots and mission.
Yeah, that is a great question. And we worked actually at Lake Institute with our friends at the Hilton Foundation and the GHR Foundation with congregations of women religious quite a bit over the last decade. And this was the question that kind of came up quite a bit, is thinking about how to kind of develop their mission development work alongside sort of aligning with the charism of the congregation or the order. And oftentimes through the sponsored ministries of sisters and congregations, like maybe in this instance, how can you sort of name the work that you're doing, but not, sort of sometimes your religious identity can be a positive, and sometimes it might, could keep people from partnering or giving in your organization. I would put the spotlight on the work that's happening. So you could, by telling the stories of change that's happening through the work that your organization's doing with the kids with these disabilities, again, painting those stories in a positive light, but shining the light on what's happening, that work that's happening, the change that's happening, and then sort of a diversity of pictures of who's doing that work. Maybe it's a sister, but I imagine it's all types of people who are employed in that organization. And this organization is doing good work. And for some people, the sisters are going to be a draw, and some people maybe that might push them against it. But your point, sometimes this does get politicized. So sometimes you find yourself in a place where, Catholic Charities would, not in your instance, but you might be kind of taking some shade from other, cases where you're thinking about adoption in different ways by, sort of organizations that take particular stands. But I would shine a light on the work that's happening tell those stories of change, and people can't disagree with that.
I agree with that. So I've always said when we're involved in these organizations, we're doing God's work, and therefore we should be rewarded on a financial basis from people wanting to give more money to organization. And I think the idea that we have to show results of our work, what's been the result of the labors that we've done. And if we truly make a difference, people will want to be part of that. And if we're not making a difference over time, that kind of plays out.
Yeah, and just to advocate, just to sort of put a one more finer point on that, sometimes faith-based charities, congregations in particular, can make the presumption that because they're doing God's work, that people just should give. Like if you're a person of faith, you should give to your congregation, you should give to this faith-based work. Maybe that's true, but they oftentimes maybe have fallen behind on the best practices of nonprofit and fundraising practice to sort of, you have to show that you're doing good work, whether it's storytelling, whether it's accountability, and presenting the numbers of impact and outcomes. But I think that's what we need to do. And if we're doing God's work as an organization, then it's going to be proven to be true in the stories and numbers that we can demonstrate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Liz?
Yeah, no, actually, we do have another question that has come in. And I think one of our attendees says, as the chief fundraiser, I end up using different language with older donors versus younger ones. The older ones are definitely motivated by faith. Our younger are more focused on services, something completely different online and on the website. So I wonder if that is also your experience. I know in philanthropy in general, we talk a lot about generational giving and the differences between Gen Z, Gen Y, Gen X, boomers, and the like. So, just that as a comment, is that something that you are experiencing, and how?
Yes, I think so. I think, while we don't want to overemphasize the generational differences across donors, there are many things that I think that are important to be true. And I think across the board, I think it's true that younger donors particularly are motivated by not only their passion and values, but they want to see how things are making a difference. And they're not sort of assuming that the faith-based organization is doing something better than another charity. So out of their own faith tradition, if they're motivated by faith or values, they just assume to give to a sort of a secular nonprofit if that nonprofit's showing, real change happening. But I do think an older generation is formed in practices and traditions, particularly within their faith context, that sort of presumes these faith-based connections earlier. And so the way we oftentimes talk about it, we help organizations with a message map. So thinking about that core home base, what is your key message, and then sort of building out from there. You're going to demonstrate it through a program or through a story and add evidence for change, and then kind of come back to home base. And you can branch out in a variety of different ways. And so I think it's very appropriate and necessary to sort of maybe segment your audience, your donor base, but also at least have multiple messages that are not talking out of both sides of your mouth, to be clear, right? You still have the same home base. Your core vision and work is the same, but illustrating that in different ways and tying into the motivations, passions of different sets of donors is completely appropriate. Mm-hmm. And a chief fundraiser, a leader of the organization, becomes quite adept at digging into those different messages and how to illustrate it with the different constituencies that they're engaged with.
Right. And so what I think I hear you saying is giving programs, philanthropic programs within faith-based organizations, I think I heard you say maybe have fallen behind a little bit of their secular counterparts as it relates to, segmenting your audience, having your core message, but then a little bit different message for different audiences. And I think I hear you saying this is something that now more than ever may be important. Is that true?
Yeah, I wouldn't want to paint too broad of a brush here, because an organization like World Vision, for example, is kind of cutting edge on their fundraising and marketing practices. And many organizations fall into that same boat. But yes, I think traditionally, oftentimes, faith-based organizations, particularly congregations and more traditional, faith-based nonprofits, may have just sort of assumed a particular type of giving structure that they're the priority or the primary recipients of the gifts of many within their tradition or their membership, and may not have invested as much initially in sort of learning from the best development and fundraising and stewardship practices.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, it's not an either or, right? A faith-based organization could and should, and many are sort of oftentimes implementing the best practices that we know from fundraising, from donor stewardship, from marketing and development. That doesn't change depending on the type of organization we're in, but taking those key skills and adapting or adopting them into the particular context you're in I'd say that's the reason why good fundraisers and good leaders succeed. They can do that soft work in working with donors and developing just those kinds of messages to connect with.
Absolutely. Absolutely. This has been a really, really interesting conversation, and it's given me a whole lot to think about as it relates to that intersection of what drives us to give as people, what motivates our donors in traditionally faith-based organizations that maybe have grown into a different identity, an additional identity, and those that remain very strong in their faith identity, and really those commonalities we have amongst us, and how all of us need to really be focused on what is that core message, core founding, why our raison d'etre, and go from there and connect with the people who want to support our good work and our important outcomes through that messaging. So thank you so much. Friends, here today, David has discussed a range of aspects about the intersection of faith and giving and international philanthropy. And David, is there one thought that you would like to leave our audience with before we wrap things up for the day, to make sure that we're all moving forward with where we need to be looking for our North Star?
Well, the two things I would say would be, one, just as we've talked about faith-based donors or faith-based organizations, just to continue to remember that that's not a single category. Across the wide, vast religious diversity that we have across the landscape in the U.S. and beyond, donors are exceedingly diverse and complicated. They have multiple motivations. So a faith-based donor might be motivated for all different types of reasons. And so getting to know that donor, being in relationship with them over time, continues to be the best way to engage with individuals to support your cause. And the same would be true for fundraisers. So just as I mentioned earlier, no matter what your own religious or spiritual background might be, to be willing and not to be shy or scared to go there in those questions of values and meaning making within your organization, but also with your donors, because that's a key skill, I think, across the board to help put your thumb on what the values are that resonate with your organization. And doing that work to discern that with a donor is not only a gift to your organization, it's a gift to that family or that individual as well. So finally, I just want to say thank you. Thanks, Liz, and Bill, for the chance to have this kind of conversation, to be open to this sort of line of discussion on a topic that obviously is something we care a lot about at the Lake Institute and the School of Philanthropy, but I'm grateful for the chance to share it with your audience as well.
Thank you. Thank you. We're grateful you could be here with us today. And friends here who joined us for this very, very important conversation with David, I hope that we've made a difference to you all today so that you can help your donors give that gift of their insights, of the diverse motivations for giving to you, and you can give them that gift of listening to them. Thanks everyone for your great questions, your insights, and thank you all for coming here today. I hope the session will help guide your organization. So friends, as we wrap up, Please join us for our next conversation for On Giving on Tuesday, October 10th at 12 p.m. Eastern with Doctors Genevieve Shaker and Aaron Conley. I think they are good friends and colleagues of yours at Indiana University, David. And they'll be discussing their prize-winning research book, Fundraising Principles for Faculty and Academic Leadership. And quite frankly, this may be a really good one that some of our folks here today, because they've got very smart, very, very knowledgeable leaders who may not be fundraisers amongst their ranks. And in fact, I'm going to make sure that this recording gets sent to the folks who come to Genevieve and Aaron's, because some of these really, really hold true across academic leadership and religious leadership, because we've got folks at the top of the organization with very honed and specific expertise that may want a little more insight into their fundraising. So David, this has been really invaluable. I see some of these comments that are coming in. Thank you. Invaluable information. Great presentation. Thank you for your time. David, it's been tremendous. Bill, thank you for being a part of the conversation and helping to curate the questions. And I'd also like to thank the firm's project and operations manager, Sarah Garvey, for her technical support here today. Go forth, do good work. Philanthropy is a powerful force for good. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.